product of months of negotiation with my colleague, Mr. Hill, and reflects many bipartisan compromises. As one of the co-authors of the Dodd-Frank Act, my goal in this amendment is to create a more efficient process for policymaking and implementation of the Volcker Rule. And I anticipate a lot of support for this amendment by people in this room, and perhaps no one more significant than the gentleman whose image is on the wall behind us here, who does support it. I guess for the record, that was indicating former Chairman Barney Frank. The Volcker Rule is a critical piece of our response to the financial crisis. Insured depository institutions had way too much exposure to volatile capital markets, and when they were all left holding large amounts of what became toxic assets, we had a financial crisis. This bill will not alter the substance of the Volcker Rule or weaken the general proposition that insured depository institutions should not be engaged in proprietary trading. Instead, it would give the Federal Reserve, the regulator at the top of the corporate hierarchy for any institution, the bank holding company, the pen for writing that policy. Some critics of this idea point to the current structure of a committee of 5 regulators, with each wielding a veto, as a proper balance for promulgating strong financial protections. That structure has pros and cons, with the biggest downside being the risk that regulation by a committee of regulators may be insufficiently responsive to rapidly changing market conditions. This veto power also seems to result in delays in obtaining interpretive guidance on the rule, which is not good for industry and not good for oversight. In the conversations our office had with former prudential regulators, we were told that the current structure too often results in a consensus forming around the weakest proposal. Consolidating the rulemaking authority at the Fed will make for a more efficient process that will drive greater consistency and clarity. Importantly, this bill makes it clear that the Fed is to consult with the other regulators as appropriate to incorporate their views on issues where they might have some unique perspectives. It also retains the objectives of the current law that the Fed is to consider in writing the rule. It expressly ensures that the current rules remain in effect until the Fed sees a need to act, and directs all of the regulators to ensure consistent implementation and enforcement. And while driving more consistent implementation and enforcement of the rule, it recognizes that federal banking oversight currently has overlapping jurisdiction. It uses the definition of the Federal Deposit Insurance Act for, quote, appropriate federal banking agency, unquote, to establish an authoritative agency over every institution for the purposes of enforcing the Volcker Rule. The bill recognizes that prudential regulators are not charged with oversight of broker-dealers and FCMs, so the SEC and CFTC retain jurisdiction there. Finally, my amendment expressly preserves the FTC's backup examination authority of all institutions based on its role as in protecting the DIF. Section 4 of the bill exempts banks from having less than $10 billion in assets, and less than 5% of those assets as trading assets from the rule. These institutions are not engaged in these activities and have limited resources to engage in them, and as a result of their size alone, they do not pose a systemic risk. I began discussion of this legislation with the view that a rebuttable presumption of compliance might have provided sufficient regulatory relief for these smaller banks. But I heard from a variety of community bankers and former regulators that it would not in fact shrink their compliance operations because they would still need to stand prepared to make the proof on short notice. These institutions are not engaged in hedging activities. These institutions are engaged in hedging activities and not proprietary trading. They also do not make markets. Because the exemption has a cap at 5% of assets as trading assets, a well-capitalized bank could take 100% losses on them without hitting the Deposit Insurance Fund. The Volcker Rule was meant to be a simple proposition, but the actual rule is incredibly complicated, more complicated, most feel, than it needs to be. This is partly because it was written by a committee that required unanimity. This bill would create a process that is more efficient, more responsive to emerging dangers in the marketplace, and should result over time in a simpler and clearer rule, and will ensure more consistent implementation. It in no way weakens the ban on proprietary trading and operation of funds inside a Wall Street bank, and I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and, upon its adoption, the bill. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?